The poor little girl returns missing wallet to white millionaire. Hours later, police show up at school. The sound of applause filled Lincoln Middle School's auditorium as 12-year-old Emily Thompson stepped onto the stage to receive her Academic Excellence Award. Her worn shoes shuffled across the polished wood, and her second-hand uniform had been carefully pressed by her mother that morning. Despite her pale complexion and the dark circles under her eyes, Emily managed a brave smile. Principal Roberts was just handing her the certificate when it happened. The room began to spin, and the certificate slipped from Emily's trembling fingers. The last thing she heard was her best friend Tom's voice, shouting her name before everything went black. Emily. Emily Sarah Thompson burst through the emergency room doors, her waitress uniform still on and name tag askew. She found her daughter lying unconscious, her small frame dwarfed by the hospital bed. The steady beep of monitors filled the sterile room. Miss Thompson, Dr. Anderson approached, his face grave. "Your daughter's condition is worse than we thought." "Her heart," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Emily needs surgery, and soon." Sarah's world crashed around her. She knew Emily had been born with a weak heart, but they'd been managing with medication. How much, she whispered, already dreading the answer. The procedure costs $250,000. With insurance, Dr. Anderson trailed off as Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I lost my insurance when they cut my hours at the diner," she admitted, clutching Emily's cold hand. "I've been picking up extra shifts, but..." In the hospital chapel later that night, Sarah Thompson knelt alone. Her second job's cleaning uniform was stuffed in her bag, and she still had a night shift at the gas station ahead of her. 3 jobs, and she still couldn't afford to save her daughter's life. "Please," she whispered into the quiet chapel, "I can't lose her too." Not after James, her late husband's face flashed in her mind his warm smile the day he left for his final shift as a firefighter, never to return. Outside the chapel window, storm clouds gathered over the city skyline. Tomorrow morning, Emily Thompson would walk this same path to her weekly hospital checkup. Tomorrow morning, she would find a wallet that would change everything, though not in the way anyone could have imagined. But for now, in the chapel's silence, a mother prayed for a miracle she couldn't afford to believe in. If this emotional opening moved your heart and you want to witness Emily's extraordinary journey ahead, don't let this story slip away. Join our community now. One simple click to subscribe will reveal the powerful tale of love, courage, and hope. Emily Thompson was not your typical 12-year-old. Born with a heart condition that painted dark circles under her crystal blue eyes, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed far beyond her years. Her blonde hair, often tied back in a practical ponytail, framed a face that held both innocence and an old soul's wisdom. Despite spending more time in hospital waiting rooms than playgrounds, Emily maintained her position as the top student at Lincoln Middle School. Her textbooks were her constant companions, dog-eared and filled with careful notes in her neat handwriting. While other children complained about homework, Emily saw each assignment as a gift, a normal piece of childhood she could claim between medical appointments. The heart condition that threatened her life had also shaped her character. Emily learned early that every breath was precious, every moment a blessing. She watched other girls run and play during recess from her usual spot under the old oak tree, sketching in her notebook or reading letters from her late father. James Thompson's final letters, written during his last firefighting shifts, were her most treasured possession. In class, Emily sat in the front row, not because of her health, but because she genuinely loved learning. Her teachers often found themselves moved by the intensity of her focus, the way she absorbed knowledge like a lifeline to a future she wasn't guaranteed. Even when pain made her hands shake, her writing remained steady, her determination unwavering. But it was Emily's kindness that truly set her apart. Despite her own struggles, she tutored younger students during lunch breaks. sharing not just knowledge but also her infectious hope. She saved part of her lunch money each week to buy treats for the stray cats behind the school. On days when her health allowed, she helped Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly neighbor, carry her groceries up 3 flights of stairs, even though the effort left her breathless. At night, when pain kept her awake, Emily wrote in her journal letters to her father in heaven, "Dear Dad." She would write, "Today I got an A on my science test. Mom worked extra shifts again. I pretended not to hear her crying in the bathroom. I wish you were here to hug her like you used to. I'm trying to be strong like you taught me." The other students called her Ghost Girl behind her back, a reference to her pale complexion and quiet presence. But Emily didn't mind. She had inherited her father's philosophy: it's not what people call you that matters, it's what you answer to in your heart. And in her heart, Emily answered to her father's daughter, brave, kind, and unflinching in the face of adversity. Her room, though small, was a testament to her dreams. Medical textbooks borrowed from the library lined her shelves. Emily was determined to become a doctor someday, to help other children like herself. Above her bed hung her father's firefighter badge, polished weekly, a reminder of heroism and sacrifice. On her desk sat a piggy bank labeled Heart Surgery Fund, where she saved every penny she could, even knowing it was barely a drop in the ocean of medical bills. Each morning, Emily rose before dawn to take her medications, carefully counting out pills that kept her heart beating. She never complained, not when the medicines made her sick, not when dizziness forced her to sit down in the middle of school hallways, not even when she had to miss school plays and field trips because of hospital visits. But sometimes, in the quietest moments when she thought no one was watching, Emily would press her hand against her chest, feeling her struggling heart, and whisper a simple prayer: "Please, just a little longer. Mom needs me, and I'm not finished being brave yet." This was Emily Thompson, a girl whose fragile heart housed an indomitable spirit, whose every day was a quiet act of courage, and whose story was about to intersect with a lost wallet that would change not just her life, but an entire community's understanding of what it means to be truly rich. Sarah Thompson's life was measured in shifts: morning waitress at Joe's Diner, afternoon cleaning at the local office building, and night shifts at the 24-hour gas station. Her once auburn hair, now streaked with premature grey, was perpetually tied back in a practical bun that had to comply with 3 different workplace dress codes. The lines around her eyes told stories of sleepless nights and endless worry, but her smile, reserved solely for Emily, remained as bright as summer sunshine. At 35, Sarah was both mother and father to Emily, a role thrust upon her when her husband James died saving a family from a burning building 5 years ago. The firefighter's pension helped initially, but Emily's mounting medical bills quickly depleted their savings. Now Sarah lived in a carefully orchestrated dance of juggling bill payments, medication costs, and basic necessities. Her day began at 4:30 a.m., preparing Emily's medications and a breakfast she couldn't afford to eat herself. She'd pack her daughter's lunch with foods approved by the cardiologist, often going without lunch herself to ensure Emily had what she needed. Between shifts, she would rush to the hospital for Emily's appointments, still wearing whatever uniform belonged to her previous job, apologizing to doctors for her appearance while memorizing every detail of her daughter's condition. The small apartment they called home had become a testament to Sarah's resourcefulness. She'd learned to repair everything herself: the flickering kitchen light, the temperamental heating system, the leaky faucet that sang them to sleep at night. The furniture was second-hand but meticulously maintained, each piece cleaned weekly with homemade solutions to save money. Their walls were decorated with Emily's artwork and academic certificates, creating an illusion of normalcy that Sarah desperately tried to maintain. At work, Sarah was known for never saying no to an extra shift. Her colleagues watched her rush between jobs with a mixture of admiration and pity, but she held her head high. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford to maintain, not when every extra dollar meant another pill, another test, another chance for Emily's heart to keep beating. Late at night, after her final shift, Sarah would sit at their tiny kitchen table, spreading out bills and attempting to perform financial miracles. She'd become an expert at negotiating with collection agencies, pleading with insurance companies, and calculating exactly how long they could stretch each paycheck. The stack of medical bills grew taller each month, a paper tower of impossibility that threatened to collapse and bury them both. On rare breaks between shifts, Sarah would sneak into Emily's room and watch her daughter sleep, counting each rise and fall of her chest like a precious gift. These moments were her only indulgence, brief interludes where she allowed herself to remember James, to feel the crushing weight of doing this alone, to let silent tears fall for the husband who would never see their daughter grow up. But Sarah Thompson was not a woman who folded under pressure. James had always said she had a warrior's heart, and she proved it daily. She learned medical terminology as if studying for a degree, became an expert in insurance policies and hospital billing codes, and developed an internal GPS for every shortcut between her jobs. She carried emergency medications in all her uniform pockets and kept a detailed log of Emily's symptoms that impressed even the specialists. The other mothers at school saw her at parent meetings, somehow always present despite her crushing schedule, her uniform crisp despite its age, her attention focused entirely on Emily's education, even as exhaustion draped her shoulders like a heavy coat. They didn't know that she often went straight from these meetings to clean their own offices, too proud to accept their hesitant offers of help. "We'll make it," she would whisper to Emily's school photo in her wallet, a daily ritual between shifts. "Your father didn't save others just for us to give up. We're Thompsons, we don't break, we don't bend, we just keep going." This was Sarah Thompson, a mother whose love transformed exhaustion into energy, whose determination turned impossible into not yet, and whose story was about to intersect with a twist of fate that would test everything she believed about pride, acceptance, and the true meaning of wealth. Oakwood Heights wasn't the kind of neighborhood that appeared in tourist guides or real estate magazines. Located on the edges of the city, it was a place where dreams came to settle for less and hopes learned to make do with what they had. The Thompsons' apartment building, a weathered 5-story walk-up, stood as a testament to resilience, its red bricks faded but sturdy, like the people who called it home. Apartment 3 Billion, the Thompsons' home, was a study in careful organization and dignified poverty. The living room doubled as Emily's study area, with a second-hand desk positioned to catch the best natural light through worn curtains. Medical supplies shared space with school books on carefully dusted shelves, while a wall of achievement certificates tried to hide the water stains beneath. The kitchen was small but immaculate, its dated appliances maintained through Sarah's determination and YouTube repair videos. Emily's bedroom was the apartment's only concession to childhood whimsy. Here, hospital schedules shared wall space with posters of the solar system. A telescope, a gift from her late father, stood by the window, its lens pointed toward stars visible even through the city's light pollution. Her bed, covered with a handmade quilt from her grandmother, sat beneath a string of fairy lights that cast a gentle glow during long nights when pain kept her awake. The community around them was a tapestry of working-class lives intertwined by necessity and circumstance. Mrs. Rodriguez from Tua watched Emily after school, when Sarah worked late, sharing Mexican folk remedies and warm cookies that ignored dietary restrictions. Mr. Chen's grocery store on the corner kept a special box of heart-healthy snacks behind the counter for Emily, sometimes forgetting to charge full price. Lincoln Middle School, where Emily studied, stood 4 blocks away, its brick facade more institutional than inviting. Yet inside, teachers like MS. Parker spent lunch breaks tutoring Emily when she missed classes for medical appointments. The school nurse, Mrs. Sullivan, kept extra medications in her office, her concern extending beyond professional duty to genuine care. The local diner where Sarah worked her morning shift was a gathering place for the neighborhood's early risers. Regular customers learned to leave extra tips when they saw Sarah's eyes were particularly shadowed, their small kindnesses wrapped in the dignity of pretending not to notice her gratitude. The coffee was mediocre, but the humanity was rich. The community center, underfunded but vital, offered after-school programs where Emily could rest and study when her strength allowed. Its worn basketball court and outdated computers weren't much, but they provided a sense of normalcy for kids who had learned early that life wasn't fair but could still be good. Across town, visible from Emily's bedroom window, stood the gleaming towers of the business district. Among them, Carter Enterprises occupied 50 floors of steel and glass, its pristine exterior a stark contrast to the weathered charm of Oakwood Heights. These buildings represented another world, one of wealth, influence, and possibilities that seemed as distant as the stars Emily studied through her father's telescope. Between these two worlds ran Monroe Street, the busy thoroughfare where Emily would find the wallet that would bridge this divide. The street served as both connection and boundary, its 4 lanes of traffic carrying people between lives they lived and lives they dreamed of, unaware that sometimes fate had plans to blur these carefully drawn lines. This was Oakwood Heights, a place where struggle wore a brave face, where community filled the gaps left by circumstance, and where a young girl's story was about to remind everyone that the richest hearts often beat in the poorest neighborhoods. The morning Emily found the wallet began like any other Tuesday, with a handful of pills and a silent promise to her father's photograph. She had a cardiology appointment at 9, which meant taking the longer route past Monroe Street rather than her usual path to school. Sarah had already left for her morning shift, leaving a note with a heart drawn in shaky hands: "Stay strong, my brave girl." The autumn air bit through Emily's thin jacket as she walked, her backpack lighter than usual but still enough to make her pause every few blocks to catch her breath. She'd learned to time these rests with traffic lights, making them look intentional rather than necessary. Her heart was being particularly stubborn today, each beat feeling like a negotiation rather than a natural rhythm. Near the intersection of Monroe and 5th, where the shadow of Carter Enterprises tower stretched across the sidewalk like a sundial of wealth, Emily saw the wallet. It lay partially hidden beneath a fallen maple leaf, its black leather surface glossy with morning dew. For a moment she thought it was a mirage, something too significant to be real, like the answers to unspoken prayers. Emily knelt carefully, her knees protesting against the cold concrete. The wallet was expensive, she could tell from the designer logo embossed on its surface. It was also heavy, thick with what she immediately recognized as more money than she'd ever held in her life. Her hands trembled as she opened it, looking for identification. The driver's license belonged to Thomas Carter, CEO of Carter Enterprises. Emily knew the name, everyone in the city did. His photo smiled up at her, confident and distinguished, a man whose signature appeared on buildings and charitable foundations across the city. Behind the license, organized with meticulous care, were credit cards, business cards, and crisp $100 bills, more than enough to cover a month of her medications. As she counted the money with shaking fingers, Emily's mind raced with possibilities. The sum she held could pay for her next round of tests, could let her mother rest for a few blessed days, could buy groceries that didn't have to be carefully rationed. 1 month of breathing room, of seeing her mother smile without the weight of worry pulling at her lips. A gust of wind rustled the maple leaves around her, and with it came her father's voice, as clear as memory. Character is who you are when no one's watching. Emmy, she could almost feel his hand on her shoulder, steady and sure, just as it had been when he taught her right from wrong. Emily looked up at the towering Carter Enterprises building. Somewhere in that glass and steel monument to success, Mr. Carter's absence was probably already causing concern. She thought about how her mother would react if she lost something valuable, the panic, the sick feeling of violation, the desperate hope that someone honest would find it. Her heart gave a particularly sharp twinge, as if adding its own opinion to her moral dilemma. Emily pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the irregular rhythm that had become her constant companion. The money in this wallet could help ease her condition, but it would create a different kind of pain, one that would hurt worse than any physical ailment. With careful movements that belied her inner turmoil, Emily zipped her backpack and stood, wallet secured inside. Her legs felt weak, but her resolve was iron strong. She would be late for her appointment, but some things were more important than punctuality. Her mother had taught her that honesty wasn't a choice, it was a reflection of who you were in your soul. As Emily turned toward the Carter Enterprises building, she caught her reflection in a store window. She looked small and pale against the backdrop of the city's wealth, her second-hand clothes and worn shoes marking her as clearly out of place. But in her eyes shone something that no amount of money could buy: the quiet dignity of choosing right over easy. "I know you'd be proud, Dad," she whispered, taking the first step toward the building's imposing entrance. She'd never been inside any of the downtown towers before. They had always been like castles in fairy tales, visible but untouchable. Now, clutching the wallet that bridged these two worlds, Emily Thompson prepared to enter a realm as foreign to her as the moon she often watched through her father's telescope. What she didn't know, as she walked toward those gleaming doors, was that fate had orchestrated this moment with careful precision. The wallet she carried would do more than test her character. It would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything she believed about justice, kindness, and the true cost of doing the right thing. Standing before the gleaming doors of Carter Enterprises, Emily felt her heart flutter this time, not from her condition, but from pure nervousness. The doorman eyed her suspiciously, his gaze lingering on her worn shoes and the frayed edges of her backpack. For a moment her courage wavered, threatened to crack under the weight of his judgment. Inside her backpack, the wallet seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Emily's mind wandered to the hospital bills spread across their kitchen table, to her mother's exhausted face as she calculated and recalculated impossible numbers. Last night she'd overheard her mother on the phone with the hospital billing department, her voice cracking as she begged for more time to pay. The numbers danced in her head: $250,000 for the surgery, 3 months behind on rent. The electricity bill marked final notice in angry red letters. The money in this wallet wouldn't solve everything, but it could buy them breathing room time for her mother to sleep more than 4 hours between shifts, money for the new medications her doctor had prescribed but insurance wouldn't cover. A sharp pain in her chest forced Emily to lean against the building's cold marble exterior. She fumbled in her pocket for her emergency pills, aware of how the doorman's suspicion turned to concern. The bitter tablet dissolved under her tongue as memories flooded her mind, her father teaching her to play chess, explaining how every move had consequences, how the right choice wasn't always the easy one. "Are you all right, Miss?" the doorman asked, stepping toward her. Emily nodded, straightening up with effort. The medicine was working, but her dilemma remained. She thought of her classmate Jenny, whose family had lost everything when someone stole their savings. The look in Jenny's eyes when she talked about it, the violation, the helplessness, the broken trust haunted Emily. Through the glass doors, she could see people in expensive suits rushing through the lobby, their lives so different from her own. Mr. Carter probably wouldn't even miss this money, she reasoned. To him it might be nothing more than pocket change, while to her family it could mean survival. But then her father's voice echoed in her memory: right and wrong don't change based on who's watching, Emmy. They don't change based on who's rich or poor. They don't even change based on how much you want them to. She remembered him saying this the night before his last shift, when he explained why he had to go back into that burning building even though he knew the risks. Emily's hand slipped into her backpack, fingers brushing against the smooth leather of the wallet. She thought about her latest journal entry to her father: "Sometimes I wonder if being brave is worth it when everything hurts so much." Now, standing here, she understood that this wasn't just about a wallet, it was about who she was, who she wanted to be. A new wave of pain washed over her, but this time it wasn't from her heart condition. It was the sharp ache of knowing that doing the right thing meant walking away from a solution to their problems. Her mother would work another exhausting shift tonight, tomorrow, and every day after, while Emily continued to gather coins for a surgery fund that seemed as distant as the stars. Still, there was her father's badge at home, polished and proud on her wall. There were her mother's sacrifices, made without complaint because they were necessary, because they were right. And there was Emily herself, 12 years old, with a failing heart, but an unshakable understanding of integrity. Taking a deep breath, Emily pushed open the heavy glass door. The cool air inside hit her face like a judgment, and the clicking of expensive shoes on marble floors created a rhythm that seemed to match her unsteady heartbeat. Security cameras watched from above as she approached the reception desk, her reflection ghost-like in the polished floor. The receptionist looked up, perfectly manicured eyebrows rising at the sight of this small, pale girl in her second-hand clothes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting that whatever Emily needed, this was probably not the place to find it. But Emily swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper, as she replied, "I found Mr. Carter's wallet." She began to unzip her backpack, hands trembling not from weakness now, but from the weight of her decision. "I need to return it to him." In that moment, as she stood in the lobby of a world she didn't belong in, Emily Thompson made her choice. She chose her father's memory over immediate relief, her mother's teachings over temporary comfort, and her own integrity over the temptation of an easier path. What she didn't know was that this choice would soon test not just her character, but the character of everyone around her. The Carter Enterprises lobby stretched before Emily like a cathedral of commerce, all soaring ceilings and gleaming surfaces that made her feel smaller with each step. The receptionist, Ms. Winters, according to her nameplate, had picked up her phone while keeping a suspicious eye on Emily, who stood clutching the wallet like a lifeline. "Mr. Carter's office, Ms. Winters spoke into the phone, her voice crisp and professional. As she paused, examining Emily with a critical eye, ... young girl here, who claims to have found his wallet. The emphasis on claims made Emily's cheeks burn, but she stood her ground, remembering her father's words about dignity being something no one could take unless you gave it away. The elevator ride to the 50th floor was an exercise in endurance. Emily's heart protested the rapid ascent, forcing her to lean against the mirrored wall. Her reflection stared back at her pale face, second-hand clothes, determination in her blue eyes. A young executive in the elevator shifted away slightly, as if poverty might be contagious. Mr. Carter's executive suite occupied the entire floor. The doors opened to reveal a world of mahogany and leather, where even the air seemed expensive. An elegant woman in a tailored suit approached, introducing herself as Margaret Phillips, Mr. Carter's personal assistant. Her smile was professional, but her eyes were wary. "So, you found Mr. Carter's wallet, Ms.?" Phillips asked, holding out her hand. Emily nodded, reaching into her backpack. "I was on my way to the hospital, my doctor's appointment," she explained, her voice growing stronger. "It was on Monroe Street, near the maple trees." "Ms." Phillips took the wallet, her perfectly manicured fingers running over the leather surface. She opened it, methodically checking its contents. Emily watched, her heart racing not from exertion now, but from the implied suspicion in every movement. "All the money is there," Emily said quietly, pride and hurt mingling in her voice. "I didn't take anything, Ms." Phillips looked up sharply, perhaps hearing the dignity in the child's tone. For a moment their eyes met the sophisticated executive and the working-class girl, separated by circumstance but connected by this moment of truth. "Wait here, Ms." Phillips instructed, disappearing through heavy wooden doors. Emily sank into a leather chair that probably cost more than their monthly rent, her legs trembling from the morning's exertion. She would definitely be late for her appointment now, but some things were more important than punctuality. The wait stretched on, giving Emily time to observe this rarefied world. Fresh flowers in crystal vases adorned every surface. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see her neighborhood in the distance, looking small and gray from this height. Somewhere down there, her mother was serving coffee to people who would never set foot in this office. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She had forgotten to eat breakfast again, saving the last of their bread for her mother's lunch. Emily closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing like the doctors had taught her. When she opened them, she found MS. Phillips watching her with a softened expression. "Are you all right?" the assistant asked, her professional mask slipping slightly to reveal genuine concern. Emily nodded, sitting up straighter despite her lightheadedness. "Just tired." She lied, not wanting pity from this woman who probably spent more on coffee each day than her family had for groceries. The heavy doors opened again, and Thomas Carter himself emerged. Emily had seen him in newspapers and on TV, but in person he was more imposing, tall and distinguished, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to look straight through you. He held his wallet in one hand and a piece of paper in the other. "Emily Thompson," he read from the paper, his voice deep and resonant. 12 years old, straight a student at Lincoln Middle School, he looked up, studying her with an intensity that made her want to shrink into the expensive chair. "Tell me, Emily, why did you go to such trouble to return my wallet?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Emily thought of all the possible answers because it was right, because her father taught her better, because integrity mattered more than money. "Instead," she said simply, "because that's what I'd want someone to do for my mom." Something flickered in Mr. Carter's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or recognition of something he hadn't expected to find in his pristine office on this ordinary Tuesday morning. He stepped closer, and Emily forced herself not to shrink back, to meet his gaze despite her exhaustion and hunger. What happened next would change everything, though Emily couldn't know it then. She couldn't know that her simple act of honesty was about to collide with long-buried secrets, or that the true test of her character was still to come. All she knew was that she had done the right thing, and that would have to be enough. The moment shattered like glass when MS. Phillips gasped, her eyes fixed on her computer screen. "Mr. Carter," she called sharply. There's a discrepancy. The warmth that had begun to build in the office froze instantly. "The wallet contained $5,000 when you last checked it. There's only $4,000 here." Emily's world tilted sideways. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sudden roaring in her ears. "I didn't. I wouldn't." Her heart began to race dangerously, its uneven rhythm matching her rising panic. Mr. Carter's face hardened, years of business suspicion overriding the momentary connection. "Are you certain about the amount?" Margaret, his voice had lost its warmth, becoming the tone that had closed $1,000 deals and ended careers. "Absolutely, sir. You took out cash yesterday for the Children's Hospital donation. $5,000 exactly. I logged it myself, MS." Phillips's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up records with mechanical efficiency. Security arrived within minutes, two men in dark suits who looked at Emily as if she were a problem to be solved. Behind them, a police officer stepped into the office, his badge catching the morning light. Emily recognized him. Officer Bennett sometimes patrolled near her school. "Young lady," Officer Bennett began, his professional tone unable to completely mask his disappointment, "we need to discuss the missing money." The irony of being accused of theft while trying to be honest made Emily's chest tighten painfully. "I didn't take anything," Emily protested, her voice breaking. "I found the wallet and brought it straight here." "Mum always says." She stopped, tears threatening to fall. Her mother. What would this do to her mother? MS. Philip stepped forward, her heels clicking accusingly on the marble floor. "Perhaps if we check her backpack." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke, toxic and spreading. Emily clutched her backpack closer, not from guilt, but from the humiliation of what they would find: her worn textbooks, the carefully counted pills in their labeled containers, the half-eaten granola bar saved from yesterday's lunch. Her poverty laid bare for their judgment. Emily, Mr. Carter spoke, his voice carrying the weight of authority. If you return the money now, we can handle this. Discreetly, the offer was meant to be kind, she supposed, but it stung worse than an outright accusation. Officer Bennett moved closer, each step echoing in Emily's ears. Your mother is Sarah Thompson, isn't it? Works at Joe's Diner. The mention of her mother made Emily's heart stutter dangerously. She fumbled for her emergency medication, but her shaking hands couldn't manage the child-proof cap. She needs medical attention, someone said, but the voice seemed distant. Emily was focused on breathing, on staying upright, on holding onto consciousness as her world crumbled around her. The next few minutes blurred together, her backpack being searched, the pitying looks as they discovered her medications, the phone call to her mother, the growing certainty in everyone's eyes that they had found a thief masquerading as a good Samaritan. Through it all, Emily kept repeating, "I didn't take it. Please, I didn't take it," but her protests sounded weak even to her own ears, drowned out by the evidence they thought they had. Sarah Thompson, Officer Bennett spoke into his phone. "This is Officer Bennett. We have your daughter Emily at Carter Enterprises. There's been an incident." The pause before incident carried the weight of judgment, of lives about to change. Emily could hear her mother's voice through the phone, panic rising with each word. She wanted to call out, to explain, to protect her mother from this new burden, but the room was spinning now, her heart racing beyond control. "The girl needs medical attention," Mr. Carter said sharply, watching as Emily's face grew paler. "Get the paramedics up here," but his concern seemed clinical, detached, the liability assessment of a CEO, rather than the worry of someone who had, moments ago, almost believed in her honesty. As Emily slumped in the expensive chair, fighting to stay conscious, she caught fragments of conversation around her pressing charges. Criminal record. Juvenile detention. Each word was another stone added to the weight crushing her chest. Through her darkening vision, she saw MS. Phillips pick up her phone again, probably calling for those paramedics. The woman's face showed a flicker of doubt now, watching Emily's medical crisis unfold. But doubt wasn't enough to undo accusations, to restore trust, to protect what was about to be lost. The last thing Emily saw before losing consciousness was Officer Bennett's face, concern warring with disappointment as he looked down at her. She wanted to tell him about the maple leaves where she'd found the wallet, about her father's badge at home, about how her mother had taught her that honesty wasn't negotiable. Instead, darkness claimed her, and Emily Thompson, honor student, devoted daughter, honest heart, slipped away, leaving behind a room full of people who had judged her worth by the price of her shoes and the contents of her backpack. Emily regained consciousness in the security office of Carter Enterprises, the harsh fluorescent lights making her head pound. Her mother sat beside her, still in her waitress uniform, tears streaking her makeup. Officer Bennett stood by the door, while a stern-faced detective introduced himself as Detective Morrison. "Mrs. Thompson," Detective Morrison began, his tone professionally detached. "Given your daughter's medical condition, we're conducting this interview here rather than at the station." He emphasized medical condition, as if it were somehow relevant to the accusation of theft, making Emily's cheeks burn with shame. Sarah's hand tightened around Emily's. "My daughter is not a thief," she stated, her voice steady despite her obvious exhaustion. "James, her father, was a firefighter. He died saving people. We may be poor, detective, but we have our integrity." Detective Morrison consulted his notes. "Mrs. Thompson, your family is 3 months behind on rent. You have substantial medical bills. The missing $1,000 would have helped with that, wouldn't it?" The question hung in the air like poison. "I didn't take any money," Emily whispered, her voice hoarse. "I counted it carefully before bringing it up. There was exactly $4,000. Her precise memory of the amount seemed to only heighten their suspicion. Outside the office, whispers spread through the building like wildfire. By lunchtime, the story had reached Lincoln Middle School. Emily Thompson, the quiet honor student with the dead father and sick heart, caught stealing from Thomas Carter himself. Principal Stevens called Sarah that afternoon. Given the circumstances, he said delicately, perhaps Emily should take a few days off until this is. Resolved the suggestion wasn't optional, and they all knew it. Word spread through Oakwood Heights with cruel efficiency. At Joe's Diner, customers who had known Sarah for years suddenly found reasons to sit away from her section. Mrs. Rodriguez stopped offering to watch Emily after school. Even Mr. Chen's friendly smile faltered when they passed his store. The police investigation continued with methodical indifference to the damage it caused. They interviewed Emily's teachers, asking about any changes in behavior. They questioned her classmates, turning childhood friendships into potential evidence. Only Tom Parker, her best friend since third grade, stood firmly in her defense. Emily wouldn't steal from anyone, Tom insisted to Detective Morrison. She once made me walk 6 blocks to return $1 someone dropped. You're all wrong about her. His loyalty cost him the next day. His mother forbade him from speaking to Emily. Sarah lost her job at the diner first. It's not personal, her manager explained, not meeting her eyes. But customers have concerns. The cleaning service followed, citing trust issues. Only the night shift at the gas station remained, where Sarah worked alone with her shame and worry. Emily's hospital appointment, forgotten in the chaos, had to be rescheduled. But when they arrived at the cardiologist's office, the nurse's formerly warm welcome turned cool. "We'll need payment in advance from now on," she said, avoiding Emily's eyes. That evening, as mother and daughter sat in their quiet apartment, the weight of accusation pressed down like a physical presence. Sarah sorted through bills with trembling hands, calculating how long they could survive on one part-time job. Emily watched her mother's face grow older by the minute, guilt consuming her even though she knew she was innocent. "Mum," Emily whispered, "maybe we should move. Start fresh somewhere else." The suggestion broke something in Sarah. She pulled Emily into her arms, her tears falling into her daughter's hair. "We're not running," Sarah said fiercely. "Your father didn't raise a thief, and I didn't raise a coward. We'll face this together," but her voice cracked on the last word, betraying her fear. The news vans arrived the next day, hungry for the human interest story. Poor girl betrays billionaire's trust. They parked outside the apartment building, cameras ready to capture the fall of a family that had already lost too much. Emily watched from her window as neighbors hurried past the reporters, some stopping to share their thoughts. Always seemed like such a good girl, and you never really know people, and her poor mother, raising her alone. Each comment was a knife, each sideways glance a wound. Emily's heart condition, always precarious, worsened under the stress. But the hospital that had treated her since birth now required full payment, upfront money they no longer had. That night, Emily wrote in her journal, "Dear Dad, everyone thinks I'm a thief now. I wish you were here to tell me how to be brave when it hurts this much. Mom's trying to be strong, but I hear her crying at night. I didn't take the money. Dad, I swear on your badge I didn't. But nobody believes me. Not even God seems to be listening anymore." She didn't know then that somewhere in the Carter Enterprises building, a security camera had captured something that would change everything. But for now, Emily Thompson, her mother, and their fractured reputations sat in their darkening apartment, surrounded by bills they couldn't pay and neighbors who no longer waved hello. Sarah Thompson's final job ended on a Tuesday, exactly 1 week after Emily found the wallet. The gas station owner, a man who had known their family for years, couldn't meet her eyes as he handed over her last paycheck. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he mumbled, "but the company has policies about employees with family members under investigation." The apartment felt smaller that night, as if the walls were closing in with each passing hour. Emily sat at their tiny kitchen table, watching her mother make dinner from their dwindling supplies. The electricity had been shut off that morning, and they were cooking on a camping stove borrowed from Tom's family before they, too, had turned away. "Mom," Emily whispered, pushing her soup around the bowl, "maybe I should tell them I took it. Maybe if I confess." Sarah's spoon clattered against the counter, the sound sharp in the dimming light. No, Sarah's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "We don't lie, Emily, not even to make things easier. Your father," her voice caught, "your father died telling the truth about that building's stability. We honor him by staying honest, no matter what it costs us." The costs were mounting. Emily's medications, already expensive, had to be rationed now. Each pill was split carefully, stretched to last until they could somehow find money for more. Her heart condition worsened with the stress, each skipped dose a gamble they couldn't afford to avoid. And their neighbors, once a supportive community, now treated them like a cautionary tale. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been like a grandmother to Emily, crossed herself when they passed in the hallway. Mr. Chen's grocery store posted a sign, "We reserve the right to refuse service." The message wasn't subtle. Emily's school books sat untouched, her forced absence stretching into its second week. Principal Stevens had called it a cooling-off period, but the implication was clear: they were protecting other students from the girl who would steal from a benefactor. The worst came when they found the graffiti on their apartment door, "Thief," in bright red letters. Sarah scrubbed at it for hours, her hands raw from cheap soap and determination, but the shadow of the word remained, like their reputation, permanently stained. Late that night, Emily heard her mother on the phone with the hospital billing department. "Please," Sarah begged, "she needs these medications. We can't wait for the investigation to clear." Her heart, the response was apparently negative. Sarah's sob after hanging up echoed through their darkened apartment. Emily slipped from her bed and found her mother crumpled at the kitchen table, illuminated by their last candle. Unpaid bills created a paper mountain before her, each one stamped with increasing urgency. The final notice from their landlord lay on top, the eviction date circled in unforgiving red. "I'm sorry, Mum," Emily whispered, her own heart aching more from guilt than her condition. Sarah looked up, and in the candlelight, Emily saw something she'd never seen before: fear in her mother's eyes. "Listen to me, Emily Rose Thompson." Sarah pulled her daughter close, her voice fierce despite her tears. "You have nothing to be sorry for, nothing. We are Thompsons. We survive, we stay honest, we keep going." But survival was becoming harder. Their pantry held enough food for perhaps 3 more days. Emily's next cardiology appointment loomed, necessary but impossible without insurance or cash. The walls of their small apartment seemed to hold their whispered prayers, their quiet tears, their fading hopes. In her room, Emily took out her father's badge, its surface still gleaming despite everything. "I didn't take it, Dad," she whispered to the cold metal. "I didn't take it, but sometimes I wish I had. At least then I'd deserve what's happening to us." Tomorrow would bring more challenges, another day of avoided glances, of whispered accusations, of watching her mother try to hold their world together with nothing but will and love. Tomorrow would mean another day of rationed medicine, of ignored phone calls from bill collectors, of wondering how much more they could lose. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of their apartment, mother and daughter held each other, their shared warmth more valuable than any amount of money could be. They didn't know that across town, in the gleaming towers of Carter Enterprises, someone was about to discover something that would change everything. They didn't know that their darkest hour was about to meet its match in the most unexpected way. For now, they had only each other, their unshakable truth, and a legacy of integrity that no accusation could tarnish, even if it cost them everything else. The seizure struck without warning during another sleepless night. Emily's heart, stressed beyond its limits by rationed medications and constant anxiety, finally rebelled. Sarah awoke to the sound of her daughter's body hitting the floor, the thud echoing through their dark apartment like a gunshot. Sarah's scream pierced the night as she rushed to her daughter's room, finding Emily convulsing on the floor, her lips turning blue. The emergency medications were gone, their last doses used days ago when they could no longer afford refills. Sarah's trembling fingers dialed 911, her voice breaking as she begged for help. "Please," she sobbed into the phone, "my daughter has a heart condition. She's having a seizure. We're at Oakview Apartments. 3 billion. The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, asking about Emily's medical history. Sarah could barely form the words, watching helplessly as her daughter's small body shook. The paramedics arrived in minutes that felt like eternities. They worked efficiently, their faces grim as they assessed Emily's condition. Her heart rhythm is dangerously irregular, one reported, attaching monitors with practice speed. But how long has she been off her medications? Sarah's silence was answer enough. The lead paramedic, a woman named Rodriguez, no relation to their former neighbor, looked at her with a mixture of concern and understanding. We need to get her to County General immediately. Her heart can't take much more of this. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and medical terminology. Emily, now unconscious but stable, looked impossibly small on the stretcher. Sarah held her daughter's cold hand, wondering how they had reached this point, how trying to do the right thing had led them here. At the hospital, the emergency room staff moved with urgent efficiency. Dr. Anderson, who had treated Emily since her diagnosis, appeared as if summoned by some medical sixth sense. His face showed no judgment about their circumstances, only concern for his patient. "Sarah," he said quietly, pulling her aside while nurses worked on Emily, "her heart can't take this kind of stress. Without her regular medications, she's at risk for complete cardiac failure. We need to admit her immediately." The words complete cardiac failure hit Sarah like physical blows. "We don't." "I can't," she struggled to explain their situation, but Dr. Anderson held up a hand. "First we stabilize her," he said firmly. "We'll figure out the rest later." His kindness, the first they'd experienced in weeks, made Sarah's composure finally crack. She sank into a plastic chair, tears flowing freely. Hours passed in the harsh fluorescent light of the cardiac care unit. Emily's condition stabilized but remained critical. Her heart, weakened by weeks of inadequate medication, struggled with each beat. The monitors beeped steadily, marking time in electronic pulses that seemed to mock their circumstances. Tom Parker, defying his parents' orders, appeared at the hospital shortly after dawn. His face was pale with worry as he handed Sarah a crumpled envelope. "It's not much," he mumbled, "just my savings and some money I borrowed from my sister. Please, Mrs. Thompson, let me help." Sarah wanted to refuse, to maintain their last shred of pride, but Emily's monitors beeped accusingly. Pride wouldn't keep her daughter's heart beating. With trembling hands, she accepted the envelope, her whispered thank you carrying the weight of a mother's desperate gratitude. Dr. Anderson returned with test results that afternoon. His expression made Sarah's own heart stutter. "The strain on her heart has caused significant damage," he explained gently. "Without immediate intervention and proper medication, Emily's condition will continue to deteriorate." The numbers he quoted for treatment made Sarah's head spin. Even with Tom's generous offering, they were thousands short. The hospital's financial assistance programs were already stretched thin, and their previous application had been denied due to the ongoing police investigation. Emily drifted in and out of consciousness, each awakening briefer than the last. During one lucid moment, she grabbed her mother's hand with surprising strength. "Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the machines. "I'm sorry I found that wallet. I'm sorry I tried to do the right thing." Sarah's heart shattered at these words. What kind of world punished a child for being honest? What kind of justice system destroyed lives while searching for truth? She watched her daughter slip back into unconsciousness, each labored heartbeat a reminder of how much their integrity had cost them. As night fell again, Sarah sat by Emily's bed, holding her daughter's hand and watching the monitors track her struggling heart. The nurses moved quietly around them, their faces showing the special kind of sympathy reserved for patients they weren't sure would make it. In her other hand, Sarah clutched her phone, staring at the number for Detective Morrison. One call, one false confession, one lie to trade for her daughter's life. The temptation was almost unbearable. But then she looked at Emily's face, peaceful in unconsciousness, so like her father's in its quiet strength. James had died rather than lie about that building's safety, saving lives with his final truth. How could she dishonor that sacrifice, that legacy of integrity, even to save their daughter? Outside the hospital window, the lights of Carter Enterprises Tower glowed in the distance, a beacon of wealth and power that seemed to mock their suffering. Somewhere in that building was the truth they needed, but for now, all Sarah could do was watch her daughter's heart struggle to beat and pray that honesty wouldn't cost them everything they had left. Tom Parker stood in the school library after hours. Surrounded by computers he'd convinced the librarian to let him use for homework. In reality, he was conducting his own investigation into the wallet incident. As Emily's best friend since third grade, he knew in his bones that she was innocent. "Look at this," he muttered to himself, scrolling through security footage he'd managed to access through his sister's internship at Carter Enterprises. The grainy video showed Emily finding the wallet, but something else caught his attention, a figure in the background, moving quickly away from the scene. Tom had been spending every free moment like this, piecing together a timeline. His bedroom walls were covered with printouts, notes and photographs, making it look like a detective's office. His parents thought he was obsessing, told him to let it go, but Tom couldn't, not while Emily lay in a hospital bed, her life falling apart. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. While reviewing footage for the 100th time, Tom noticed something odd about Ms. Phillips, Mr. Carter's assistant. On the morning of the incident, she had arrived unusually early, looking agitated. The security logs showed her accessing the executive floor before anyone else arrived. "Wait a minute," Tom whispered, leaning closer to the screen. He rewound the footage, watching Ms. Phillips's movements again. She had walked past the spot where Emily would later find the wallet, but something was off about her stride, a slight hesitation, a quick glance around. Tom's hands shook as he pulled up his carefully organized notes. Ms. Phillips had been the one to first notice the missing money. She had been the one to log the original amount. And now, reviewing the footage, Tom saw something that made his heart race, a small slip of paper falling from her hand at exactly the spot where the wallet would be found. Working frantically, Tom began cross-referencing timestamps. The security footage showed Mr. Carter leaving his office the previous evening with the wallet in his pocket. The next morning, Ms. Phillips arrived early, and shortly after, the wallet appeared on the sidewalk. The pattern was there, but proving it would be another matter entirely. Tom printed everything he'd found and stuffed it into his backpack. He needed help, someone with authority who would listen. Officer Bennett, who'd been skeptical of Emily's guilt from the start, might be willing to look at the evidence. But first, Tom needed to visit Emily. At the hospital, he found Sarah Thompson dozing in an uncomfortable chair beside Emily's bed. The monitors beeped steadily, marking each precious heartbeat. Tom's throat tightened, seeing his best friend looking so small and pale among the medical equipment. "Mrs. Thompson," he whispered, gently waking her. "I found something. I think I can prove Emily's innocence." Sarah's eyes snapped open, hope and fear warring in her expression as Tom spread his evidence across Emily's bedside table. Together, they reviewed everything he'd discovered. Sarah's hands trembled as she looked at the security footage stills, the timestamp logs, the pattern Tom had pieced together. But why, she asked. Why would Ms. Phillips do this? Tom had been wondering the same thing. His research had uncovered something else. Ms. Phillips had been passed over for a promotion the day before the incident, a position given instead to someone from outside the company. The timing couldn't be coincidence. She needed a distraction, Tom explained, his voice gaining confidence. Something to draw attention away from her own actions. Emily was just. Convenient, the cruelty of it made his voice crack with anger. Sarah stood suddenly, gathering the papers with determined movements. "We need to take this to the police," she said, but Tom held up his hand. "I already called Officer Bennett. He's meeting us here in 20 minutes. And Tom hesitated, then continued, "I sent copies of everything to 3 different news stations. If they try to bury this, it'll go public." Emily stirred in her sleep, as if sensing the change in the room's energy. Tom looked at his best friend, remembering all the times she'd stood up for him, helped him with homework, shared her lunch when he forgot his. Now it was his turn to fight for her. Officer Bennett arrived right on schedule, his face serious as he reviewed Tom's evidence. "This," he said finally, "this changes everything." He was already reaching for his phone, calling Detective Morrison. Tom sat beside Emily's bed while the adults moved into action around him. He took her hand, noticing how cold it felt. "Hang on, Em," he whispered. "We're going to fix this. Just hang on a little longer." Outside the hospital room, wheels were already in motion. Officer Bennett was dispatching units to Carter Enterprises. Detective Morrison was obtaining warrants. News vans were beginning to gather outside the hospital, drawn by the possibility of a story even bigger than the original scandal. Tom stayed where he was, keeping vigil beside his friend. He'd done what he could, piece together the truth from fragments of digital evidence and careful observation. Now it was up to the adults to make it right. Sarah returned to the room, her face showing the first real hope in weeks. She hugged Tom tightly, whispering thank you over and over. Tom hugged her back, understanding for the first time how his own mother must feel when she held him. As dawn broke over the city, Tom watched the first rays of sunlight paint the hospital room in shades of gold. Soon Ms. Phillips would arrive at her office, unaware that her carefully constructed plan was about to unravel. Soon the truth would come out. But for now, Tom Parker, 13-year-old amateur detective, sat beside his best friend's hospital bed, holding her hand and watching the monitors track her heartbeat. He had done what Emily had taught him to do: stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. Now he just prayed it would be enough to save her. The morning sun had barely touched the glass walls of Carter Enterprises when Ms. Phillips arrived at work, her designer heels clicking confidently across the marble lobby. She nodded to security, just as she had done every morning for the past 15 years. But today was different. Today, Detective Morrison was waiting by her desk. "Margaret Phillips," he said, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. "We need to discuss the events of last Tuesday." Behind him, Officer Bennett stood guard by the door, while forensics teams carefully examined her computer. The color drained from Ms. Phillips's face as she saw the evidence spread across her immaculate desk: security footage, stills, timestamp logs, and most damning of all, her own handwritten note about the wallet's contents dated before Emily Thompson had ever found it. "I can explain," she began, but her voice faltered as Mr. Carter himself emerged from his office. His face, usually composed, showed a storm of emotions: anger, disappointment, and something deeper, guilt for having doubted an innocent child. "Explain what, Margaret?" he asked quietly. "How you orchestrated this whole thing? How you used an honest child's good deed to cover your own actions?" Each question landed like a physical blow, making Ms. Phillips sink into her chair. The truth spilled out in a rush of justifications and excuses. The promotion she'd been promised, given to an outsider. The missing funds from the charitable foundation she managed, hidden by creative bookkeeping until now. The perfect scapegoat in a poor girl with a heart condition who would doubt her desperation. Across town, in Emily's hospital room, the news arrived via Officer Bennett's phone call. Sarah Thompson listened, with tears streaming down her face as years of experience in corporate investigations helped the police unravel Ms. Phillips's scheme in hours. The missing $1,000 had never been in the wallet. Ms. Phillips had planted it there herself, already short $1,000 to match her doctored records. She had counted on everyone's willingness to believe the worst about a poor family in desperate circumstances. Television crews gathered outside Carter Enterprises, their cameras capturing Ms. Phillips's walk of shame as she was led out in handcuffs. The story spread rapidly: corporate executive frames sick child in failed cover-up attempt. The same reporters who had condemned Emily now clamored to tell her story of perseverance and wrongful accusation. Mr. Carter watched the scene unfold from his office window, his hands clasped behind his back. The image of Emily Thompson standing in this same office, insisting on her innocence despite every evidence of her need, haunted him. He had let his position, his experience with corporate deception, blind him to simple truth. In the hospital, Emily finally opened her eyes to find her room filled with flowers, cards, and stuffed animals from people rushing to make amends. Tom sat beside her bed, grinning as he explained how he had pieced everything together. "You know what gave her away?" he asked, holding up a printout of the security footage. She looked left before dropping the wallet. "You're right-handed, Em. In the footage of you finding it, you naturally reached with your right hand. Little details matter." Sarah Thompson received 3 job offers that afternoon, including one from Carter Enterprises with full health benefits. The hospital billing department called to discuss adjusting their outstanding balance. Even Mrs. Rodriguez appeared, tears in her eyes, begging forgiveness for having doubted them. But it was Mr. Carter's visit that truly marked the turning point. He came alone, leaving his usual entourage behind. Standing in the hospital room, the powerful CEO looked somehow smaller, more human. "Emily," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I owe you an apology. Not just for doubting you, but for allowing a system to exist where someone could so easily take advantage of a child's honesty." Emily, still weak but improving with proper medication restored, managed a small smile. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Carter. I just did what my dad taught me was right." The mention of her father seemed to strike something in Mr. Carter. He looked at the firefighter's badge Sarah kept on the bedside table, then back at Emily's face. "Your father," he said slowly, "was James Thompson." Sarah nodded, surprised by his reaction. "He died in the Riverside building collapse 5 years ago. He stayed behind to warn others about the structure's instability." Mr. Carter's face went pale. "I owned that building," he whispered. "Your husband's warning saved dozens of lives, including my son's. He was there for a job interview that day." The revelation hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Emily reached for her mother's hand, while Mr. Carter struggled to compose himself. The connection between them had suddenly shifted, deepened by shared history and sacrifice. "Perhaps," Mr. Carter said finally, "it's time for some long-overdue changes at Carter Enterprises. Starting with a new charitable foundation, one focused on supporting families of first responders and children with medical needs." As the sun set over the city that evening, Emily Thompson lay in her hospital bed, her heart finally beating a steady rhythm. Outside her window, the Carter Enterprises tower gleamed in the dying light, no longer a symbol of wealth and power, but of truth's eventual triumph over deception. The wallet that had started it all sat in an evidence locker downtown, its contents now a footnote in a larger story about honesty, persecution, and redemption. Emily had lost much in the past weeks, but she had gained something more valuable, proof that doing the right thing, no matter how difficult, was always worth the cost. Just as Emily's world seemed to be righting itself, fate had one more devastating card to play. While reviewing old files for the new charitable foundation, Mr. Carter discovered something that made his blood run cold. There, buried in the Riverside building accident reports, was a detail everyone had missed: a maintenance request signed by Margaret Phillips 3 days before the collapse, warning about structural issues, a warning she had deliberately buried. The revelation hit him with physical force. MS. Phillips hadn't just framed an innocent girl, she had been indirectly responsible for James Thompson's death. The paper trembled in his hands as he read further. She had been the building's administrative supervisor at the time, before her promotion to his personal assistant. Mr. Carter reached for his phone to call Detective Morrison, but before he could dial, his office door burst open. MS. Phillips stood there, having made bail, her usual polished appearance now disheveled. In her hand, she held something that made his heart stop: a small revolver. "You weren't supposed to find that file," she said, her voice unnaturally calm. No one was ever supposed to know her hand shook slightly, but her grip on the weapon remained firm. At the hospital, Emily was having her best day since admission. The new medications were working, her color had improved, and the doctors were discussing discharge plans. Sarah sat beside her bed, filling out paperwork for her new position at Carter Enterprises, when Tom burst into the room, his face pale with urgency. "Turn on the news," he gasped, grabbing the remote himself when they moved too slowly. The local station was broadcasting live from outside Carter Enterprises. Breaking news: armed situation developing at Carter Tower. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth as they watched the scene unfold. The reporter's voice was tense. Sources confirm that former executive Margaret Phillips has taken CEO Thomas Carter hostage. Phillips was recently arrested for fraud and attempting to frame a local girl in a theft case. Emily's heart monitor began beeping faster as she recognized the gravity of the situation. "Mom," she whispered, "this is all my fault. If I hadn't found that wallet." "No," Sarah said firmly, but her voice caught as she watched police vehicles surround the building on the television screen. "None of this is your fault, Emily. This goes much deeper than we knew." Inside Carter's office, the situation was deteriorating. MS. Phillips paced frantically, years of carefully constructed facades crumbling with each step. "I worked there for years," she ranted. "I knew every crack, every weakness in that building. I reported it, but repairs would have cost millions. Then your son had to schedule that interview, and that righteous firefighter had to play hero." Mr. Carter's mind raced. Behind his desk, he could see the police positioning themselves on neighboring buildings through his windows. One wrong move could end everything. "Margaret," he said carefully, "James Thompson's daughter is in the hospital right now because of what you did to cover your tracks. Haven't enough people suffered?" The mention of Emily seemed to trigger something in MS. Phillips. "That girl." She spat. "That girl ruined everything by being so perfectly honest. Do you know how hard I worked to get where I am? How many compromises I made? Then this child comes along with her father's moral compass and her mother's determination." Back at the hospital, Emily was fighting her own battle. Her heart, stressed by the tension and guilt, was struggling to maintain its rhythm. Dr. Anderson had been called in, his face grave as he checked her vitals. "She needs to calm down," he told Sarah quietly. "Her heart can't take this level of stress yet." But how could Emily calm down when she watched the crisis unfold on television, knowing it had all started with her found wallet? The situation at Carter Enterprises reached its breaking point when MS. Phillips, tears streaming down her face, finally revealed the full truth. "I knew the building was dangerous," she confessed, her voice breaking. "I knew people could die. But I had worked so hard for that promotion, and the repair costs would have ruined everything I'd built." Mr. Carter listened with growing horror as she detailed years of covered-up safety violations, of corners cut and warnings ignored. Each word was another weight added to James Thompson's sacrifice, another twist of fate that had left a young girl fighting for her life in a hospital bed. In her hospital room, Emily suddenly sat up straight, her face set with the same determination that had led her to return the wallet in the first place. Despite her mother's protests, she reached for her phone. "Mr. Carter needs to know," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "About Dad's last words. About what he really saw in that building, because James Thompson, in his final radio transmission, had mentioned something specific, something that only now made sense." The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture more complex and tragic than anyone had imagined. A wallet dropped on a sidewalk had set in motion a chain of events that would uncover not just one crime, but a history of deception that had cost a hero his life. As police snipers took their positions and negotiators tried to talk MS. Phillips down, the truth hovered on the edge of revelation. In her hospital bed, Emily Thompson held a piece of that truth, her father's last words, preserved in a final report she had never shared, words that would change everything once again. Emily's voice trembled as she spoke to Detective Morrison over the phone, her mother holding her hand tight. Dad's last radio transmission, she said, it wasn't just about the building's stability. He mentioned a name he said Phillips knew. Ask Phillips about the basement logs. The detective's sharp intake of breath carried through the speaker. In Carter's office, the negotiator's phone buzzed with this new information. MS Phillips saw the change in his expression and tightened her grip on the gun. James Thompson knew, she whispered, more to herself than to Mr. Carter. He found the maintenance logs I'd hidden in the basement. That's why he was down there when the building started to collapse. He wasn't just checking the structure, he was gathering evidence. Mr. Carter watched the realization transform her face. The proud executive was gone, replaced by someone haunted by 5 years of buried guilt. You let him die, he said quietly, to protect yourself. I didn't mean for anyone to die, MS. Phillips screamed, the gun shaking violently in her hand. He wasn't supposed to be there. None of them were supposed to be there that day. Your son's interview wasn't even scheduled for that morning, it was supposed to be the next week. In the hospital, Emily and Sarah listened to the standoff through Tom's police scanner app. Dr. Anderson hovered nearby, monitoring Emily's heart rate as it spiked with each new development. The truth about her father's death was unfolding in real time, and her heart struggled to bear it. Mom, Emily gasped suddenly, remembering something else. Dad's notebook, the one they found with him. Remember how some pages were missing? Sarah's eyes widened with understanding. They had always assumed the missing pages were destroyed in the collapse. Tom was already moving, his fingers flying over his phone. The evidence logs from the Riverside collapse, he said. They might still have everything they recovered. His research skills, honed over weeks of clearing Emily's name, now turned to uncovering an even deeper truth. Back in the office, the standoff had reached a critical point. MS. Phillips stood by the window, tears streaming down her face as she looked out at the city she had tried so hard to conquer. I spent my whole life climbing, she said softly. Every step calculated, every move planned. Then James Thompson had to play hero. He wasn't playing, Mr. Carter responded, his voice firm. He was being who he was, a man of integrity. Like his daughter, the mention of Emily seemed to hit MS Phillips like a physical blow. That girl, she whispered. When she walked into this office with the wallet, looking so much like her father, I thought fate was mocking me. All these years of hiding what I'd done, and there she was, James Thompson's eyes staring at me through his daughter's face. In the hospital, Tom's research had paid off. The evidence room, he announced triumphantly. They still have everything from the collapse catalogued, including a water-damaged notebook listed as personal effects J. Thompson. Detective Morrison, still on the phone, immediately dispatched officers to retrieve the notebook. Time seemed to slow as they waited, Emily's heart monitor marking the seconds with steady beeps that grew increasingly irregular as the stress mounted. Stay with us, Emily, Dr. Anderson murmured, adjusting her medication. Your father's truth is finally coming out. You need to be here for it. The notebook arrived at Carter Enterprises just as MS. Phillips's resolve began to crack. When the negotiator read the contents of the water-stained pages, her composure finally shattered completely. James Thompson had documented everything: the falsified inspection reports, the ignored warnings, the systematic cover-up of structural issues. But most damning of all was his final entry, written the morning of the collapse. M. Phillips offered bribe to stay quiet. Refused. Going to check basement one last time. If anything happens to me, all evidence is with Maintenance Chief Rodriguez. The gun clattered to the floor as MS Phillips collapsed. Years of carefully constructed lies crumbling around her. Mr. Carter rushed to secure the weapon as police burst into the office, but his mind was already racing ahead to a hospital room where a young girl had paid the price for years of corporate corruption. In that hospital room, Emily finally allowed herself to cry, not just for her father, but for the truth he had died protecting. Sarah held her daughter as monitors beeped warnings about her elevated heart rate, but these tears needed to fall. "Your father," Sarah whispered, stroking Emily's hair, "would be so proud of you. You're his daughter in every way that matters. When you found that wallet, you made the same choice he did: truth over convenience, right over easy." As the sun set over the city, two scenes played out simultaneously. Ms. Phillips being led away in handcuffs, her carefully constructed world finally shattered, and Emily Thompson receiving the answers she had never known she needed. Her father hadn't just died a hero, he had died fighting the same battle for truth that she had unwittingly continued. The wallet that had started it all seemed insignificant now, a tiny pebble that had started an avalanche of truth. But as Emily's heart finally began to stabilize, its rhythm growing stronger with each revelation, she understood something profound. Sometimes the smallest acts of honesty had the power to unravel the grandest deceptions. The next morning's headlines blazed across every newspaper corporate cover: "Up exposed 5-year-old tragedy linked to recent wallet incident." Media trucks crowded the hospital parking lot, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like metal flowers seeking truth instead of sun. Inside her hospital room, Emily watched the chaos unfold on TV with a strange sense of detachment. Her father's notebook lay open on her lap, its water-damaged pages telling a story of integrity that had cost him his life. Mr. Carter sat in the visitor's chair, his usual commanding presence softened by exhaustion and regret. "I should have looked deeper 5 years ago," he said, his voice heavy with responsibility. "When the investigators ruled it a structural failure, I accepted it. I never questioned why James was in the basement instead of evacuating. I never pushed for more answers." Sarah stood by the window, watching reporters position themselves for their live broadcasts. "James always said that truth finds its way to the surface," she replied softly. "He believed it so strongly that he died for it. And now, through Emily, he's been proven right." The story had captured the nation's attention: a firefighter's final act of whistleblowing, his death covered up by corporate greed, and his daughter unknowingly continuing his fight for truth years later through a simple act of honesty. The parallels were too powerful to ignore. Mr. Carter cleared his throat, pulling out a thick envelope. "This won't bring back your husband," he said to Sarah, "or give Emily back the weeks she spent in this hospital. But I hope it will help secure your future." Inside was a check that made Sarah gasp: compensation not just for the recent ordeal, but for 5 years of lost pension and benefits they should have received after James's death. But money wasn't the only thing changing. As Ms. Phillips's confession spread through the media, other former employees began coming forward. The culture of silence at Carter Enterprises had been broken, and with it came a flood of revelations about similar cover-ups across the corporate world. Tom, who had become something of a celebrity at school for his role in uncovering the truth, sat beside Emily's bed reading comments from an online forum. "People are calling for changes in corporate safety regulations," he reported excitedly. "They're calling it the Thompson Rule: mandatory protection for whistleblowers." Emily's heart monitor beeped steadily now, stronger with each passing day. The truth had brought more than justice, it had brought healing. Dr. Anderson had noticed the improvement in her condition as soon as the truth about her father emerged, as if resolving this hidden burden had somehow strengthened her physically. "Your heart's getting stronger," he told her during morning rounds. "Just like your father's legacy." The words carried a weight that went beyond medical observation. Outside the hospital, the city was changing too. Carter Enterprises announced a complete restructuring of its safety protocols and the establishment of the James Thompson Memorial Fund for Corporate Ethics. Mr. Carter himself stepped down as CEO to focus on reforming business practices across the industry. The wallet that had started it all became a symbol, displayed in a case in the newly renovated Carter Enterprises lobby, alongside James Thompson's recovered notebook. But below them, a plaque read: "Truth comes in many forms. In memory of James Thompson, and in honor of Emily Thompson, 2 generations of unwavering integrity." Sarah found a new strength in the aftermath, speaking at corporate events about the importance of ethical business practices. Her story of single motherhood, struggle, and vindication resonated with audiences across the country. But it was her message about teaching children integrity that hit hardest. How Emily's simple act of returning a wallet had unraveled years of corporate deception. As Emily prepared to finally leave the hospital, her room filled with flowers and cards, not just from well-wishers but from families of other whistleblowers who had lost their lives fighting corporate corruption. Each story reinforced the impact of her father's sacrifice and her own unwitting role in exposing the truth. Mr. Carter made one final visit before her discharge, bringing with him an architect's rendering of a new building, the James Thompson Center for Corporate Ethics and Whistleblower Protection. "This," he said, laying the plans across Emily's bed, "will be built where the Riverside building once stood, a reminder that integrity can rise from the ashes of deception." As Emily studied the plans, her father's badge pinned to her hospital gown, she felt a sense of completion. The wallet, the arrest, the revelation, all of it had led to this moment, where her father's final act of courage could finally be honored. "Dad would have liked this," she said quietly, tracing the building's outline with her finger. "Not the building, but what it stands for. He always said that doing the right thing creates ripples we might never see." Sarah wrapped an arm around her daughter, both of them strong enough now to bear the weight of truth and its consequences. "Those ripples," she said, "they're changing the world, Emmy. One truth at a time." Just when it seemed justice had prevailed, an invisible enemy struck. Emily's heart condition, aggravated by weeks of stress and inadequate medication, took a dramatic turn for the worse. The morning she was supposed to be discharged from the hospital, her body betrayed her in the cruelest way possible. Sarah was helping Emily pack her few belongings, both of them laughing about Tom's latest visit, when Emily suddenly clutched her chest. The color drained from her face, and she collapsed into her mother's arms. The monitors erupted in a cacophony of alarms that brought medical staff running. "Code blue. Code blue in room 412, the announcement echoed through the corridors as Dr. Anderson sprinted into the room. Emily's heart had stopped completely, no irregular rhythm, no weak pulse, just silence where there should have been life. Starting compressions, a nurse began CPR while another prepared the defibrillator. Sarah found herself pushed against the wall, watching helplessly as medical professionals fought to restart her daughter's heart. Each compression on Emily's small chest seemed to echo the words she had spoken just moments before about her father's legacy. Clear, the first shock lifted Emily's body off the bed but produced no response. Dr. Anderson's face showed the strain as he called for another attempt. Charging to 300. Clear, still nothing. In the corridor outside, Tom had arrived for his daily visit, only to find chaos. Through the window, he watched his best friend's life hanging by a thread. His hands shook as he called Mr. Carter, who had become like a second father to Emily during her recovery. The stress of everything, Dr. Anderson explained, between attempts to revive Emily, combined with the lingering effects of missing medications. Her heart couldn't take it. Another shock, another moment of desperate hope, another disappointment. Sarah slid down the wall to the floor, her legs no longer able to support her. "Please," she whispered, whether to God or to Emily or to the universe itself, she wasn't sure. "Please don't take her too. Not like James. Not when we've only just found the truth." Mr. Carter arrived as they prepared for a fourth attempt at resuscitation. He stood in the doorway, his face ashen, watching the cruel irony unfold that Emily might survive uncovering a 5-year-old conspiracy only to be defeated by her own fragile heart. "She needs immediate surgery," Dr. Anderson announced after they finally achieved a weak, thready pulse. "Her heart is failing. Without intervention in the next few hours," he left the sentence unfinished, but everyone understood the stakes. The surgery would be risky, extremely risky. Emily's weakened condition made her a poor candidate for such an invasive procedure, but without it she would certainly die. The cost, even with insurance, would be astronomical. "Money is no object," Mr. Carter stated firmly, already pulling out his phone to make arrangements. But Sarah stopped him with a gentle hand on his arm. "It's not just about the money," she said, her voice breaking. "The surgery. Dr. Anderson says there's only a 30% chance she'll survive it, and if she does, she couldn't finish the sentence." Through the window, they could see Emily's pale face, barely visible among the tubes and wires keeping her alive. The girl who had stood up for truth, who had unknowingly continued her father's fight for justice, now fought her own battle for survival. Tom pressed his hand against the glass, remembering all the times Emily had helped him with math homework, had defended him from bullies, had simply been there when he needed a friend. "You can't give up," he whispered. "You're too stubborn to give up." The monitors continued their ominous beeping, each sound a reminder that time was running out. Dr. Anderson needed a decision: attempt the risky surgery or watch Emily slip away. Sarah stood between her daughter's bed and the window, caught between impossible choices, just as she had been 5 years ago when they told her James wasn't coming home. The truth about the Riverside building collapse had finally come to light. Justice had been served, but the price of that justice threatened to be higher than anyone had imagined. As Sarah watched her daughter fight for each breath, she wondered if truth always demanded such devastating sacrifices from the Thompson family. In the corner of the room, Emily's backpack still held her father's badge, polished and proud. Next to it lay the newspaper headlines celebrating the exposure of corporate corruption. But none of that would matter if Emily's heart, the heart that had chosen honesty over ease, truth over convenience, couldn't find the strength for one more fight. The surgery preparation moved with desperate urgency. Sarah signed consent forms with trembling hands while Mr. Carter made calls to bring in the country's top cardiac surgeons. Within hours, 3 specialists had arrived by private helicopter, their faces grave as they reviewed Emily's case. Dr. Winters, the lead surgeon, spoke candidly in the consultation room. "Her heart has sustained significant damage. The surgery itself could kill her, but without it," he spread his hands helplessly, the gesture more eloquent than words. "Even if she survives, she may need a transplant eventually." Sarah sat rigid in her chair, her mother's heart warring with stark reality. The odds were brutal: 30% chance of survival with surgery, 0 without it. Behind her, Tom paced restlessly, his young mind refusing to accept the possibility of losing his best friend. "There's something else," Dr. Anderson added hesitantly. "The type of surgery Emily needs. It's still experimental. Only a handful of hospitals have attempted it on pediatric patients." The word experimental hung in the air like a death sentence. In Emily's room, machines had taken over most of her body's functions. Her chest rose and fell mechanically, each breath pushed in and pulled out by devices that couldn't understand the importance of the life they were sustaining. The girl who had stood up to corporate giants now looked impossibly small and fragile. Mr. Carter stood at the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of red. "James Thompson died bringing truth to light," he said quietly. "Are we going to let his daughter die because we're afraid to take a chance on saving her?" The surgical team began their preparations while Sarah sat beside Emily's bed, holding her daughter's cold hand. She sang softly lullabies from Emily's childhood, songs James used to sing, anything to fill the terrible silence between monitor beeps. Tom had refused to leave, camping out in the waiting room with his laptop. He researched the procedure obsessively, reading medical journals and case studies until the words blurred together. His parents brought him food that went untouched, clean clothes that remained folded in his backpack. The neighborhood rallied around them. Mrs. Rodriguez organized a prayer vigil outside the hospital. Mr. Chen closed his store early to attend. Even the reporters who had camped outside for days lowered their cameras out of respect, some joining the circle of candlelight and hope. Inside the hospital, the surgical team worked through their preparations with methodical precision. Dr. Winters reviewed the procedure with his colleagues, each step planned and replanned. There would be no room for error. Emily's weakened heart could only be stopped for a limited time. Sarah found herself in the hospital chapel, kneeling in the same spot where she had prayed weeks ago when this nightmare began. "James," she whispered to the empty room, "I need you to guide her. Like you guided her to do the right thing with the wallet. Guide her back to me now." The hour of surgery approached with the inevitability of an executioner's drum. Nurses came to prep Emily, their movements gentle but purposeful. Each wire disconnected, each tube removed and replaced felt like another thread of hope being cut. Mr. Carter had arranged for a live video feed to the waiting room, not of the surgery itself, but of Emily's vital signs. The monitors would tell their story in beeps and lines, a digital narrative of life and death that Tom stared at until he memorized every normal range and variation. Just before they wheeled Emily into surgery, she briefly regained consciousness. Her blue eyes, so like her father's, focused on her mother's face. "Mom," she whispered through cracked lips, "I'm not afraid. Dad's waiting to catch me either way." The words, meant to comfort, broke something in Sarah. She kissed her daughter's forehead, leaving tears on the pale skin. "You tell your father it's not time yet," she managed to say. "Tell him I'm not ready to lose you both." The doors to the operating room seemed to swallow Emily whole, leaving Sarah standing in the hallway, clutching her daughter's well-worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, the book she had been reading when she found the wallet that started everything. In the waiting room, the vigil began. Sarah sat motionless, the book in her lap unopened. Tom typed frantically on his laptop, researching every beep and flutter on the vital signs monitor. Mr. Carter made calls to every religious leader he knew, covering all spiritual bases with the thoroughness of a CEO. Outside, the prayer circle grew larger. Inside, the surgeons prepared to attempt something that might save Emily's life or end it. And somewhere between heaven and earth, a firefighter's spirit stood watch over his daughter's heart, ready to guide her home, whichever home fate decided that would be. The surgery had been underway for 6 hours when the first crisis hit. The monitors in the waiting room suddenly erupted with alarms, their steady rhythms dissolving into chaos. Tom's fingers froze over his laptop keyboard, and Sarah's prayer caught in her throat. "Her heart isn't responding to the repairs," Dr. Anderson explained, emerging briefly from the operating room. His surgical mask couldn't hide the concern in his eyes. "Dr. Winters is attempting an alternative approach, but—" He spread his hands helplessly, the gesture carrying the weight of possibilities too painful to voice. Inside the operating room, Dr. Winters worked with focused intensity. Emily's heart lay exposed beneath his skilled hands, its damaged tissues refusing to accept the conventional repairs. Each attempt to restore normal function was met with resistance, as if her heart itself was tired of fighting. "BP dropping a nurse," called out. "We're losing perfusion." The team moved with practiced urgency, but underneath their professional calm lay a current of desperation. This wasn't just another patient, this was Emily Thompson, the girl who had exposed corporate corruption through a simple act of honesty. In the waiting room, Sarah clutched her husband's firefighter badge, its surface warm from her constant touch. Mr. Carter paced relentlessly, his usual corporate composure shattered by the helplessness of watching a child slip away despite all his wealth and influence. Tom had stopped typing, his research meaningless in the face of reality. Instead, he pulled up photos on his phone, Emily laughing at his terrible jokes, Emily helping him with homework, Emily finding the wallet that had changed everything. Each image was a prayer for more memories to come. Another hour passed, marked by the irregular beeping of monitors and the murmured prayers from the vigil outside. Dr. Anderson appeared again, his surgical cap askew. "We're losing her," he said softly. "Her heart. It's just too damaged. We need to consider." No, Sarah interrupted, her voice raw with emotion. "She's a Thompson. We don't give up. James never gave up, and neither will she." But even as she spoke, the monitors showed Emily's life slipping away, one faltering heartbeat at a time. Dr. Winters made one last attempt, trying an experimental technique he had only read about. As his hands worked inside Emily's chest, he found himself talking to her. "Come on, kid," he whispered behind his mask. Your dad didn't die bringing truth to light just for you to give up now." The operating room fell silent except for the ominous drone of failing monitors. The surgical team watched as Emily's heart, which had fought so bravely for 12 years, began to lose its battle. The line on the cardiac monitor grew increasingly erratic. In the chapel, Sarah fell to her knees. "Please," she begged, no longer certain who she was praying to. "I've lost James. I can't lose her too. Please don't let truth cost us everything we love." The vigil outside had grown to fill the hospital parking lot. Hundreds of candles flickered in the darkness, held by strangers touched by Emily's story. News cameras captured the scene silently, their usual commentary hushed by the gravity of the moment. Back in the operating room, Dr. Winters made one final, desperate attempt to save Emily's failing heart. As his hands worked with precision born of decades of experience, he felt something change. The damaged tissue beneath his fingers seemed to respond differently. But it wasn't enough. The monitors showed Emily's life force ebbing away, each beat weaker than the last. The surgical team exchanged glances heavy with resignation. They had fought alongside this brave heart for hours, but some battles couldn't be won. Tom, watching the vital signs monitor in the waiting room, saw the moment Emily's heart began to fail completely. He reached for Sarah's hand, offering what comfort he could as they watched the numbers drop steadily towards zero. In that moment of deepest darkness, as Emily's life hung by the thinnest of threads, Sarah could have sworn she felt James's presence. The air in the waiting room grew thick with memories of James's courage, of Emily's integrity, of a family legacy built on unwavering truth. The monitors continued their ominous descent, each beep fainter than the last. Outside, the vigil grew silent, hundreds of prayers merging into one collective hope. Inside, doctors fought against failing odds while a mother's heart broke in perfect synchronization with her daughter's. When Emily's heart stopped completely at 3:47 a.m., time itself seemed to freeze. The flat line on the monitor drew a stark line between life and death, between hope and despair. But in that precise moment, something extraordinary happened. Dr. Winters, making his final attempt to restart Emily's heart, felt something shift beneath his hands. The damaged tissue, which had resisted every conventional treatment, suddenly responded. At first it was just a flutter so faint he thought he might have imagined it. "Wait," he called out, just as Dr. Anderson was about to call the time of death. There's something his skilled fingers detected what the monitors hadn't yet registered, a whisper of life returning to Emily's heart. Suddenly the operating room erupted in a flurry of activity. The flat line on the monitor jumped, stuttered, and then remarkably began to show a rhythm. Weak at first, but growing stronger with each beat. "It's stabilizing," Dr. Anderson announced, his voice thick with disbelief. Her heart. "It's actually strengthening." The surgical team watched in amazement as Emily's vital signs began to improve, defying every medical prediction. In the waiting room, the monitors displayed the miracle in real time. Sarah, who had been silently mouthing prayers, saw the change first. "Tom," she gasped, grabbing his arm. "Look, the steady rhythm on the screen told a story of life refusing to surrender." Mr. Carter, who had been making arrangements for the worst, dropped his phone mid-conversation. The business titan, who had faced countless corporate crises, found himself wiping tears from his eyes as he watched the numbers climb back toward normal ranges. Outside, the vigil erupted in celebration as word spread. The hundreds of candles that had been flickering in mourning now seemed to burn brighter in joy. News reporters, who had been preparing to report a tragedy, scrambled to update their stories. Dr. Winters emerged from the operating room 2 hours later, exhausted but smiling. "I'd never seen anything like it," he admitted. "Just when we thought we'd lost her, her heart found the strength to fight back. It's as if someone was watching over her." Sarah finished softly, clutching James's badge. She could almost hear her husband's voice. "Thompsons don't give up, remember." The next few hours brought more miracles. Emily's vital signs continued to improve, surpassing even the most optimistic projections. The surgical repairs, which had initially been rejected by her damaged heart, now appeared to be holding perfectly. "The tissue regeneration is remarkable," Dr. Anderson explained, reviewing the post-operative scans. "It's not just accepting the repairs, it's healing itself in ways we didn't think possible. Almost like her father's strength," Tom interjected, his face bright with joy and exhaustion. "Emily always said she carried his heart in hers." As dawn broke over the city, Emily was moved to recovery. The tubes and wires remained, but they no longer seemed ominous. Instead, they were channels delivering healing to a heart that had proven as resilient as the spirit it housed. Sarah sat beside her daughter's bed, holding the small hand that had once picked up a wallet and started a chain of events that exposed corruption, honored a father's sacrifice, and now had demonstrated the power of unyielding hope. Mr. Carter stood at the window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of new beginnings. "You know," he said quietly, "I've always believed in the power of truth. But this is about more than truth. This is about legacy." The doctors couldn't explain the sudden recovery. Medical science had no answer for how a heart so damaged could heal so completely. But Sarah understood. Emily had her father's heart in more ways than one, a heart that refused to give up, that chose right over easy, that beat with the rhythm of unwavering integrity. As Emily's vital signs continued to strengthen, the story of her miraculous recovery spread throughout the hospital. Nurses who had witnessed countless deaths and recoveries spoke in hushed tones about the girl whose heart had stopped, only to return stronger than before. Tom, finally allowing exhaustion to claim him, fell asleep in the recovery room chair, his laptop still open to the research that no longer mattered. On the screen, the last webpage he'd visited remained an article about cardiac regeneration titled "The Inexplicable Power of the Human Heart." In the quiet of early morning, as Emily's heart beat strong and steady, Sarah felt a presence she hadn't experienced since James's death. For a moment, just a moment, she could have sworn she felt his hand on her shoulder, heard his voice in her ear. "She has my heart, Sarah." She always did. 2 days after Emily's miraculous recovery, Detective Morrison arrived at the hospital with a file that would change everything once again. He had been investigating MS, Phillips's records since her arrest, and what he discovered cast new light on James Thompson's death. "Sarah," he said gently, laying out documents on Emily's bedside table, "there's something you need to see. Among the papers was a letter dated the day before the Riverside building collapse, written in James's familiar handwriting but never delivered." Emily, still weak but improving hourly, watched her mother's face as she read the letter. He knew, Sarah whispered, her hands trembling. James knew exactly what MS Phillips was planning. He wasn't just checking the building's stability that day, he was gathering evidence. The letter revealed a deeper conspiracy than anyone had imagined. James had discovered that MS Phillips wasn't just covering up structural issues, she was orchestrating a controlled demolition of the building for insurance fraud. The collapse wasn't an accident, it was murder. Mr. Carter, who had arrived for his daily visit, sank into a chair as the implications became clear. His company's insurance had paid out millions for what they thought was a tragic accident. The money had funded MS Phillips's rise through corporate ranks, each promotion built on the foundation of James's death. "There's more, Detective," Morrison continued, pulling out more documents. "We found a safety deposit box key among MS Phillips's possessions. Inside was a recording James wearing a wire the day he died." The recording, played on Morrison's laptop, filled the hospital room with James Thompson's voice. Emily reached for her mother's hand as they heard him confronting MS Phillips in the building's basement. His words were clear, confident, unafraid. "I won't let you hurt anyone else. This ends today." "He died protecting people he'd never meet," Tom said softly from his corner of the room. Just like Emily risked everything to return a wallet to someone she didn't know, the parallel wasn't lost on anyone. The evidence was irrefutable. M.S. Phillips would face multiple charges of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The truth James had died protecting would finally come to light through his daughter's unwitting continuation of his final mission. Sarah found herself staring at her daughter, seeing James's determination reflected in their child's face. "You have his heart in more ways than one," she said, touching Emily's chest where beneath bandages, a newly strengthened heart beat with renewed purpose. Mr. Carter stood abruptly, his face set with decision. "The Thompson Center for Corporate Ethics won't be enough," he declared. "We're establishing the James Thompson Truth Fund. Every whistleblower who risks everything to expose corruption will have our full support and protection." The news media exploded with the revelations. Headlines proclaimed hero firefighter S final case solved by daughter S honesty and wallet return uncovers decade of corporate crime. Emily's simple act of integrity had completed her father's unfinished mission. Dr. Anderson, reviewing Emily's latest tests, shook his head in amazement. "Her recovery defies medical explanation," he admitted. "It's as if once the truth was fully revealed, her heart found its strength again." The hospital room became a temporary headquarters as officials came and went, recording statements and collecting signatures. Emily watched it all with quiet dignity, understanding now why her father had chosen truth over safety, integrity over life itself. Tom, who had appointed himself Emily's personal researcher, compiled a timeline connecting every event from the building collapse to the wallet's discovery. "It's like a puzzle," he explained, showing Emily his work. Every piece was waiting for someone honest enough to start putting them together. But Sarah found herself remembering James's words on their last morning together. "Truth has a way of finding its champions, Sarah. Sometimes it just takes time." He couldn't have known then that their daughter would be the one to prove him right. As evening fell, Emily held her father's badge in one hand and the wallet that had started everything in the other. Two objects, seemingly unconnected, that had combined to expose years of corruption and honor a father's sacrifice. "Dad knew the truth would come out eventually," she said softly, looking at her mother. "He just needed someone to be brave enough to take the first step." Her newly strengthened heart beat steadily, carrying forward a legacy of unwavering integrity. The city lights twinkled outside her window, each one representing a life James had saved by preventing future disasters, a life Emily had touched by choosing honesty over ease. Father and daughter, separated by years but united in purpose, had proven that truth, no matter how deeply buried, would always find its way to light. 1 week after Emily's recovery, Mr. Carter called an unexpected press conference in the hospital's main auditorium. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras trained on the podium, where he stood, Emily and Sarah seated beside him. 5 years ago, he began, his voice carrying the weight of revelation, Carter Enterprises lost its way. We chose profit over people, silence over truth. Today we correct that course. He gestured to a screen behind him, where a photo of James Thompson in his firefighter uniform appeared. James Thompson wasn't just a hero who died saving lives, Mr. Carter continued. He was a whistleblower who discovered a conspiracy that went to the heart of corporate America, and his daughter, Emily, through an act of simple honesty, helped bring that truth to light. The screen filled with documents, photographs, and transcripts, evidence of a systemic corruption that had cost James his life. Bank records showed millions in fraudulent insurance claims. Building inspection reports revealed falsified safety certificates. Email chains documented years of cover-ups. But this story isn't just about corporate crime, Mr. Carter said, turning to Emily. It's about legacy. About how a father's commitment to truth lived on in his daughter's heart, waiting for the right moment to complete his final mission. Sarah watched as her daughter stood, still pale but growing stronger each day, to address the cameras. Emily's voice was soft but steady as she spoke. "My dad used to say that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always right. When I found that wallet, I didn't know I was continuing his work. I just knew what he would have wanted me to do." The revelation sparked a national conversation about corporate accountability and whistleblower protection. Law firms across the country began reviewing similar cases, looking for patterns that matched the Thompson discovery. Tom, who had become something of a junior investigative reporter, created a website documenting the connections between the Riverside building collapse and the wallet incident. "It's like a masterclass in karma," he explained to Emily. "Your dad started it, and you finished it. Both of you just trying to do the right thing." Mr. Carter announced the creation of the Thompson Truth Initiative, a multi-billion-dollar program designed to protect and support corporate whistleblowers. "No one should have to choose between their conscience and their safety," he declared, looking directly at Sarah. "No family should lose a loved one for speaking truth." The hospital room that had witnessed Emily's near-death experience became a symbol of rebirth, not just of a young girl's heart, but of corporate conscience. Dr. Anderson joked that they should put up a plaque here. Truth and medicine worked miracles together. As Emily prepared for discharge, cards and letters poured in from around the country. Children wrote about standing up to bullies, inspired by her courage. Workers shared stories of workplace injustices they'd finally reported. Each letter reinforced the power of one honest act. "Your father would be so proud," Sarah told Emily, watching her pack up the Get Well cards and flowers. "Not just of what you did, but of who you are." She held up James's badge, now accompanied by a Civic Honor Medal the city had awarded posthumously. On Emily's last night in the hospital, Mr. Carter brought one final document to their room. It was a letter James had written to his unborn child, found in the evidence box from his locker. "I want my child to know," he had written, "that truth doesn't need grand gestures. Sometimes it just needs one person willing to do the right thing, no matter the cost." Emily traced her father's words with her finger, her newly strengthened heart beating in rhythm with his legacy. The wallet that had started everything sat on her bedside table, no longer just a lost item, but a key that had unlocked years of hidden truth. As the sun set on Emily's final day in the hospital, she stood at the window watching the city lights come alive. Somewhere out there, other truths waited to be discovered, other wrongs waited to be righted. Her father had started the journey, and through a simple act of honesty, she had completed it. "Ready to go home?" Sarah asked, gathering their belongings. Emily nodded, picking up her father's badge and the wallet that had changed everything. "Dad always said truth finds its way," she replied. "I guess sometimes it just needs a Thompson to help it along." 5 years after finding the wallet that changed everything, Emily Thompson stood at the podium of the newly inaugurated James Thompson Center for Corporate Ethics. At 17, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced death and emerged stronger. Her heart, once fragile, now beat with steady purpose. "My father used to say that integrity isn't about grand gestures," she began, addressing the packed auditorium. "It's about the small choices we make when no one is watching below the podium." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes while Mr. Carter, now her trusted mentor, nodded in approval. The center stood on the site of the old Riverside building, its modern architecture incorporating elements of transparency, walls of glass, open spaces, and at its heart, a memorial wall listing the names of corporate whistleblowers who had sacrificed everything for truth. James Thompson's name held a place of honor alongside the wallet that had bridged past and present. Tom, now a respected student journalist, sat in the front row, recording the event for the school paper. His investigation into the wallet incident had earned him a scholarship to study investigative journalism. More importantly, it had taught him the power of persistent truth-seeking. "When I found Mr. Carter's wallet that day," Emily continued, "I didn't know I was completing my father's mission. I didn't know that one small act of honesty would expose years of corruption. I just knew what my father had taught me, that right and wrong don't change based on who's watching." The center had already made its mark. In its first year, the Thompson Truth Initiative had protected dozens of whistleblowers, preventing disasters and saving lives. Companies across the country had adopted the Thompson Protocol. For ethical business practices, named for the firefighter who died protecting truth, Dr. Anderson sat among the guests, marveling at his former patient's transformation. Emily's recovery had become a case study in medical journals, though he suspected her healing had come from something beyond medicine, the power of fulfilled purpose. Sarah had found her own path in the aftermath. She now directed the center's family support program, ensuring that no whistleblower's family would face the struggles she had endured. Her quiet strength had become an inspiration to others walking the difficult path of truth. Mr. Carter, watching Emily speak, reflected on how one wallet had transformed not just his company, but his understanding of wealth. True wealth, he often said now, isn't measured in dollars but in the courage to do what's right. The Thompson Center stands as a beacon. Emily declared, her voice strong and clear, not just for corporate ethics, but for the simple truth my father died protecting that integrity matters, that one person's courage can change everything, that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, even when it costs us everything, is always worth it. The audience rose in a standing ovation, but Emily's eyes found her mother's. They shared a silent moment of understanding how far they had come from that morning when a sick girl found a wallet on her way to the hospital. After the ceremony, Emily visited the memorial wall. Her fingers traced her father's name, then moved to the display case holding the wallet. Such a small thing to have caused such massive change. But then, as her father had written in his final letter, sometimes truth just needed a small door to enter through. The center's programs had expanded beyond corporate ethics. There was now a medical assistance fund for families facing health crises, inspired by Emily's own struggle. The scholarship program, named for James Thompson, supported children of whistleblowers pursuing higher education. Tom joined Emily at the wall, camera hanging around his neck. "Your dad would be proud," he said softly. "Not just of the center, but of you, of who you've become." Emily smiled, touching the spot above her heart where a scar marked her survival. "Sometimes I think he knew," she replied. "Knew that truth would find its way, even if he couldn't be here to see it." As evening fell, the center's glass walls reflected the setting sun, casting long shadows across the memorial wall. Emily stood with her mother and Mr. Carter, watching visitors study the displays and read the stories of courage that had led to this moment. "Ready to go home?" Sarah asked, just as she had that day in the hospital 5 years ago. But home was different, now larger, warmer, filled with the kind of security that comes from knowing you've done what's right. Emily nodded, but paused for one last look at the wallet in its display case. Such a simple object, yet it had completed her father's unfinished mission, healed her heart in more ways than one, and shown that even the smallest act of honesty could change the world. As they left the center, its lights glowed against the darkening sky, a beacon of truth, a monument to integrity, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest legacies start with the smallest choices. The Thompson family had paid a high price for truth, but in doing so, they had ensured that others wouldn't have to. 1 year after the Thompson Center's inauguration, its impact rippled across the country in ways no one could have predicted. Emily, now preparing for college with dreams of becoming a doctor, found herself at the center of a movement that transcended corporate ethics. The Thompson effect, as the media dubbed it, began showing up in unexpected places. Elementary schools incorporated the wallet story into their character education programs. Business schools used the case study to teach ethical leadership. Medical institutions adopted new protocols for supporting families facing health crises. Sarah received weekly letters from people whose lives had been touched by their story. A janitor who exposed unsafe working conditions. A nurse who reported medical fraud. A teacher who stood up against administrative corruption. Each letter spoke of finding courage in Emily's simple act of honesty. Tom's documentary about the wallet incident, produced as his senior project, had gone viral online. It wasn't just about corporate whistleblowing anymore, he explained during a national interview. It became about the everyday heroes who choose truth over convenience, right over easy. Mr. Carter, true to his word, had revolutionized corporate culture. The Thompson Protocol became the gold standard for ethical business practices. Companies that adopted it saw increased employee satisfaction, improved public trust, and surprisingly, better financial performance. Integrity, he often said at business conferences, isn't just morally right, it's good business. His transformation from ruthless CEO to ethical business champion inspired other executives to examine their own practices. The medical community embraced the Thompson Center's family support program. Dr. Anderson helped establish a network of hospitals offering specialized care for families of whistleblowers facing health crises. Emily's case taught us that healing isn't just physical, he explained. It's about supporting the whole family through their fight for truth. Emily's heart condition became a symbol of resilience. Other young patients found hope in her story, not just of physical recovery but of moral courage. The pediatric cardiac ward where she had nearly died now displayed her photo alongside her father's firefighter badge. The wallet itself, still preserved in the center's main hall, drew visitors from around the world. People stood before it in contemplation, considering their own moral choices. Some left notes sharing their own stories of small acts of honesty that had grown into something larger. Local schools organized field trips to the center, where students learned about James Thompson's sacrifice and Emily's unwitting completion of his mission. The most popular exhibit was the interactive display, where visitors faced ethical dilemmas and explored the consequences of their choices. Sarah's support group for whistleblowers' families expanded nationwide. We understand the cost of truth, she told new members, but we also know its value. The group became a powerful network of support, advocacy, and strength. The Thompson Scholarship Fund, initially established for children of whistleblowers, grew to include any student committed to ethical leadership. Recipients were known as Thompson Scholars, carrying forward the legacy of integrity that had started with a firefighter's final stand for truth. Emily spent her weekends volunteering at the center, sharing her story with visitors and listening to theirs. Every truth matters, she would tell them. Every act of honesty, no matter how small, has the power to change lives. The city council renamed the street where Emily had found the wallet Thompson Truthway. The spot where she had picked it up now featured a small plaque here. A child's honesty began a revolution of integrity. Mr. Carter established ethics centers in every city where his company operated, each one partnering with local schools, businesses, and healthcare providers to create networks of support for truth-tellers. The Thompson model of integrated support became a template for social change. As Emily prepared for college, universities competed to offer her scholarships, but she chose the local medical school, wanting to stay close to the center and the community that had supported her family through their darkest times. Tom, accepted to several prestigious journalism schools, also chose to stay local. Some stories aren't finished, he explained. The Thompson effect is still creating ripples, and I want to document where they lead. The center's visitor book, filled with messages from around the world, thank you for showing us that one person's honesty can change everything. Your story gave me courage to speak up. The Thompson family taught us that truth always finds its way. Sarah, watching her daughter grow into a leader and healer, often found herself returning to James's words. Truth has a way of finding its champions. Through their family's journey, those champions had multiplied, creating a network of integrity that stretched far beyond the walls of one ethics center. As another sunset painted the center's glass walls in shades of gold, Emily stood with her mother and Mr. Carter, watching new visitors discover their story. The wallet that had started everything still held its place of honor, no longer just a lost item, but a symbol of how truth, once set in motion, could transform the world. On Emily's 18th birthday, a special ceremony was held at the Thompson Center. The occasion marked not just her coming of age, but the unveiling of a new initiative that would carry their family's legacy into the future. The Thompson Truth Fellowship, Mr. Carter announced to the gathered crowd, will sponsor young people who demonstrate extraordinary moral courage in their daily lives. The fellowship would provide not just financial support, but mentoring, healthcare coverage, and educational opportunities. Emily, standing at the podium where she had spoken so many times before, looked out at the faces that had become her extended family. Dr. Anderson, who had saved her life, Tom, whose investigation had uncovered the truth, the countless others who had been touched by their story. "When people ask me about integrity," she began, her voice clear and strong, "they often expect some grand philosophy. But what I learned from my father and from that wallet on the sidewalk is that integrity is built in small moments. It's the choices we make when no one is watching." Sarah watched her daughter with pride, remembering the frail girl who had once struggled up the steps of Carter Enterprises to return a wallet. Now Emily stood tall and healthy, her heart strong in more ways than one, carrying forward a legacy that had transformed countless lives. The ceremony included video messages from around the world, people sharing how the Thompson story had inspired them to stand up for truth. A nurse in Chicago who had exposed medical fraud. A teacher in Boston who had protected students from administrative corruption. A factory worker in Detroit who had reported safety violations. The Thompson effect, Tom explained in his documentary voiceover, playing on screens around the hall, wasn't just about corporate ethics anymore. It had become a movement about everyday courage, about how ordinary people could change the world through simple acts of honesty. Mr. Carter, his hair now more gray than silver, stood to make his final announcement. "Today we're not just celebrating Emily's birthday or launching a new fellowship. We're celebrating a truth that James Thompson died protecting, that integrity isn't just a word, it's a way of life." The center itself had evolved, its programs reaching far beyond corporate whistleblowing. The Medical Support Fund had helped hundreds of families facing health crises. The Education Initiative had put dozens of students through college. The Family Support Network had become a nationwide movement. But perhaps the most powerful impact was the way Emily's story had changed how people viewed everyday honesty. Schools reported decreased bullying rates. Businesses saw improved ethical behavior. Communities experienced stronger bonds of trust. "My father used to say that truth finds its way," Emily concluded her speech, holding his badge in one hand and touching the scar above her heart with the other. "But what I've learned is that truth needs champions, not just heroes who make grand sacrifices, but ordinary people who choose right over easy day after day." As the ceremony ended, visitors lingered by the wallet display, now accompanied by an interactive exhibition showing how one act of honesty had created waves of positive change. Children pressed buttons to light up different paths of impact, watching how Emily's choice had influenced lives across the country. Sarah and Emily stood together at the memorial wall, where James Thompson's name had been joined by others who had sacrificed for truth. "Your father would be so proud," Sarah whispered, squeezing her daughter's hand. "He's still here," Emily replied, looking around at the center that bore their name, at the lives that had been changed, at the legacy that continued to grow. In every person who chooses truth, in every small act of honesty, in every heart that chooses right over easy. The sun set on the Thompson Center, its glass walls reflecting the golden light of evening. Inside, the wallet that had started everything still held its place of honor, no longer just a lost item, but a symbol of how the smallest choices could change the world. And somewhere in the hearts of those who had been touched by the Thompson story, a simple truth lived on: that integrity wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic stands, but about the quiet choices we make when the world isn't watching. That was James Thompson's final lesson, completed by his daughter's unwitting courage, and now carried forward by all those who chose to make truth their compass. If this story of truth, courage, and redemption touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you do if you found a wallet that could change your life? Join our community by subscribing to witness more powerful stories of everyday heroes. Support our team's dedication to bringing these inspiring narratives to life, and help spread the message by sharing this video with friends and family. Your like, comment, and subscribe mean more than you know. They help us continue creating content that reminds us all of the power of integrity. Together, let's celebrate those who choose truth over convenience, right over easy.